The receipt hit the table, and the room went quiet. A black single-mom waitress stood frozen as a billionaire pushed back his chair and walked away. No apology, no explanation, just a zero tip staring back at her. People watched. No one spoke. Then a voice cut through the silence, loud enough to sting. "Zero! She gets nothing!" Humiliation settled in. Power had spoken. What no one noticed was what slipped from beneath his plate. Something small, deliberate, and dangerous. Because the man who thought he'd won had just made a mistake he couldn't undo. Tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Follow this channel for stories that challenge silence and expose injustice. Sarah moved through the restaurant with a quiet focus that came from years of being overlooked and still showing up anyway. She didn't rush, didn't complain, and didn't ask for sympathy. She worked. Every step, every table, every careful movement was measured, because mistakes weren't forgiven when you looked like her. Sarah Miller had learned that early. By the time her shift reached its peak, her feet ached, and her smile felt heavier than it should have. Not because the work was hard, but because the room never let her forget where she stood. Customers made eye contact with everyone except her. Managers corrected her tone more than her performance. Compliments were rare, patience even rarer. None of it was written down, but the rules were clear. Between tables, her thoughts drifted home. Leo Miller was waiting with a babysitter, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm she watched more closely than any clock. His medication was expensive, unforgiving, and never late. Sarah counted tips in her head before she earned them, calculating what she could stretch and what she'd have to sacrifice. That kind of math didn't leave room for hope, only discipline. The restaurant itself carried prestige, but not protection. Authority flowed downward, enforced by quiet looks and sharp reminders of who mattered. Mr. Henderson ruled the floor with efficiency and indifference, treating fairness like a luxury rather than a standard. When mistakes happened, blame landed where power said it should. And power rarely looked like Sarah. She didn't argue with it. She adapted. That was her strength. She knew when to speak and when silence kept her employed. Still, there was a tension in the air that night, something unsettled. The room felt watchful, like it was waiting for something to happen. Conversations hushed when certain tables filled. Staff adjusted their posture. The hierarchy tightened. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. She always did. Years of surviving biased systems had sharpened her awareness. When a man with money and confidence entered the space, the energy bent toward him without question. Chairs straightened, smiles widened, expectations changed. Sarah took a breath and squared her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would handle it the same way she handled everything else, calm, capable, and unseen if necessary. What she didn't know was that this night wouldn't end with endurance. It would end with exposure. And the systems that had quietly pressed against her for years were about to push too far. Without realizing, they were standing at the edge of something they couldn't control. The tension didn't explode all at once. It crept in, quiet, deliberate, and confident that no one would stop it. Sarah kept moving, the way she always did when a room decided she didn't matter. Plates balanced, posture straight, eyes forward. She could feel it, though. The shift. Conversations softened when she approached. Requests became sharper, less patient. The same customers who joked freely with others barely acknowledged her presence. It wasn't loud yet. It didn't need to be. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Mr. Henderson watching the floor, not helping, monitoring, waiting for something to go wrong. He always hovered like that on nights when money walked in wearing expensive confidence. Rules bent for some people, they hardened for others. At the center of it all sat Ethan, relaxed in his chair, one arm draped casually, the kind of comfort that came from knowing the room would adjust around him. His voice carried without effort. When he spoke, nearby tables went quiet, as if his presence alone demanded space. He didn't look at Sarah when she approached. He inspected her, the way someone evaluates an object before deciding its value. She took his order carefully, repeating every detail back. Precision wasn't optional, it was survival. When she turned to leave, his eyes followed her just long enough to make the point land. Moments later, the first correction came, then another. Small things. The glass wasn't placed where he preferred. The timing wasn't fast enough. Each remark landed sharper than the last, spoken loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. People glanced over. Some frowned. Most looked away. A server at the next table hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then turned back to their own work. Silence filled the gap where intervention could have lived. Sarah adjusted without complaint. She always did. But the weight of it pressed harder tonight. Every correction felt less about service and more about control. When she passed the kitchen, Mr. Henderson stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound professional. "Keep him happy," he said flatly. "We don't need problems." Sarah nodded. She didn't explain that she was already doing everything right. She didn't need to. The expectation was clear. Absorb it. Manage it. Don't escalate. At the table, Ethan smirked as she returned. His tone shifted from critical to amused, as if he were enjoying the attention his behavior commanded. "Relax," he said, waving a hand. "I'm paying for excellence." The words lingered. Excellence, in this space, had a face, and it wasn't hers. Across the room, a man in a tailored suit leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with interest. Mr. Colburn didn't hide his stare. He'd been around long enough to recognize when power put on a show. When Sarah passed by again, he chuckled under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. "Some people should be grateful for any table at all," he muttered. No one corrected him. Not the staff, not the guests. The comment settled into the room like it belonged there. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but her expression stayed neutral. She thought of Leo waiting at home, of the medication she still hadn't paid for. She thought of how quickly one complaint could cost her everything. Endurance had always been her shield. Still, something about the way Ethan watched her now felt different, less distracted, more deliberate. When she set the plate down, he looked up at her fully for the first time, eyes cold and assessing. "You people are always so serious," he said with a thin smile. "Lighten up." The table went quiet. The phrase hung there. Casual, dismissive, loaded. Sarah met his gaze for half a second too long, then stepped back. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was restraint. Behind her, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, making sure she heard it. A reminder. Don't push. Don't react. The bill came later, folded neatly. Sarah picked it up with steady hands, her heart already calculating what she hoped might be there. She knew better than to expect generosity, but even expectation had limits. When she opened it, the number stared back at her. 0. No tip, no explanation. Just a hard line through the space where dignity sometimes lived. A low murmur rippled through nearby tables. Someone shook their head. Someone else laughed uncomfortably. Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket, already finished with the moment. "Service reflects effort," he said, loud enough for the room. "Remember that." Then he walked away. Sarah stood there, the receipt trembling slightly in her fingers. The humiliation wasn't private. It never was. It was designed to be seen, to remind her, and everyone watching, where power believed she belonged. As she cleared the table, her movements mechanical, something slipped from beneath the plate and brushed her hand. She paused, glancing around. No one was watching anymore. The room had moved on. She picked it up slowly. It wasn't money. It was a folded note. And in that moment, before she even opened it, Sarah Miller understood something had changed. Not because the injustice had ended, but because it had finally gone far enough to expose the people who believed they could do it without consequence. What was written inside would decide what came next. The restaurant had already moved on, but Sarah hadn't. She stood at the service station with the folded note pressed between her fingers, its weight heavier than the tray she carried moments earlier. The humiliation still burned. Faces turning away, whispers dying quickly, the certainty that no one would step in. This wasn't just about a tip. It was about power being exercised without consequence. She unfolded the paper slowly. The words were brief, deliberate, and unsettling. A location. A time. No signature. No explanation. Just an instruction that felt less like an offer and more like a challenge. Sarah Miller read it twice, then once more, steadying her breath. Her first instinct was to throw it away. Her second was to think of Leo Miller, asleep somewhere across the city, depending on a system that had never been designed to protect them. The night air outside was sharp as she stepped into it, the sounds of traffic distant and indifferent. By the time she reached the address, the city felt different, quieter, stripped of its witnesses. A warehouse stood alone under harsh lights, doors already open. Inside, the space was clean, controlled, and waiting. Ethan Sterling was there. He didn't rise when she entered. He didn't apologize. He studied her with the same calm confidence he'd carried all evening, as if this moment had always been his to control. Papers were spread across a table, numbers and logs arranged with precision. The message was clear. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a test. Sarah didn't sit at first. She listened as he spoke, about efficiency, about mistakes hidden in plain sight, about how people underestimated details when they believed themselves untouchable. He gestured toward the documents, inviting her to look. She did. And as she scanned the pages, something familiar clicked. Patterns. Discrepancies. The kind of quiet theft that only survived because no one bothered to look closely. Halfway through the stack, the truth surfaced. The losses weren't random. They followed a rhythm. Dates lined up, values repeated, and every questionable entry carried the same approval. Marcus Thorne. A name tied to access, trust, and immunity. Sarah felt the shift inside her, anger sharpening into clarity. This wasn't chaos. It was design. She spoke once, measured and calm. This isn't an error. It's theft. For the first time, Ethan's expression changed, not denial. Calculation. The confidence didn't vanish yet, but it cracked. He asked questions now, shorter ones, his certainty slipping as the explanation unfolded. Sarah pointed out the inconsistencies, the timing, the quiet confidence of someone who believed they'd never be questioned. The room felt smaller as the truth took shape. Then the door opened. J.R. stepped inside, carrying a folder thick with records that matched what Sarah had already seen. His presence wasn't dramatic, but it was final. Physical logs, verified weights, signatures that didn't match reality. The system's blind spot, documented and undeniable. He set the folder down without a word. Ethan Sterling exhaled slowly. The room had changed. Authority no longer flowed in one direction. The second half of the night moved fast. Phone calls were made. Access revoked. Names that once carried protection were suddenly liabilities. When Veronica Vance arrived, her confidence filled the space, until she saw the documents spread across the table. The smile she wore didn't hold. Her questions came quickly, then stopped altogether as the evidence closed in. She tried once to regain control, voice tight. "You're overreacting." No one answered. The truth had already landed. The balance had tipped. And for the first time, the power that had humiliated Sarah hours earlier stood exposed and fragile. Ethan didn't look at Veronica when he spoke next. He looked at the table, at the proof, at the consequences taking shape. "It's over," he said quietly. Veronica's composure collapsed, not into anger, but into fear. The room no longer bent to her will. Silence didn't protect her now. It isolated her. Sarah stood back, watching the unraveling with steady resolve. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. The system had been tested, and it failed those who abused it. Outside, the city continued on, unaware of the shift happening inside a quiet warehouse. Before she turned to leave, Ethan spoke once more, his voice stripped of its earlier certainty. "You saw what no one else did." Sarah didn't respond. She thought of Leo, of the future waiting beyond this night, of how close everything had come to breaking the wrong way. She walked out into the darkness, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing with finality. The injustice had reached its peak. And now, with the truth fully exposed, the consequences were unavoidable. What followed would change more than one life. It would change who was allowed to walk away unchallenged, ever again. The fallout didn't take days. It took hours. By morning, access was revoked, accounts frozen, and names quietly removed from positions that once felt permanent. Marcus Thorne was suspended pending a criminal investigation, his protection gone the moment the paper trail reached outside the company. The quiet confidence that had shielded him collapsed under documented proof that couldn't be explained away. JR's records made sure of that. Physical evidence that didn't bend to influence or excuses. Veronica Vance didn't leave with dignity. Her attempts to distance herself unraveled as authorities closed in. Her status no longer enough to silence what had been exposed. The same circles that once protected her now stepped back, careful not to be pulled down with her. Consequences were no longer theoretical. They were immediate and irreversible. Ethan Sterling watched it happen without intervening. Power had taught him one lesson too many that night, and this time, it didn't let him look away. The systems he trusted had failed. The people he elevated had abused their reach, and the cost of ignoring that truth had nearly destroyed someone who never should have been invisible in the first place. Sarah Miller didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. Validation came quietly in the way her voice was finally heard, in the way decisions shifted when she entered a room, in the way no one questioned her presence again. For the first time, dignity wasn't something she had to protect alone. What mattered most waited at home. Leo Miller's future changed not because of luck, but because his mother refused to accept humiliation as the end of her story. The same resilience that carried her through long shifts and silent bias now shaped something stronger. Stability. Possibility. A life not dictated by who chose to look away. Mr. Henderson never apologized. He didn't have to. The system he enforced was dismantled around him. His authority reduced to what it should have been all along. Accountable. Coburn learned the same lesson in public silence. His laughter replaced with distance from rooms that once welcomed him without question. This wasn't justice wrapped in comfort. It was accountability without softness. Racism rarely announces itself loudly. It hides behind protocol, confidence, and silence, thriving when people decide it's not their problem. But this story proves something simple and unsettling. Systems don't collapse when challenged by force. They collapse when exposed. Sarah Miller didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. And the question that remains isn't what happened to them. It's how many times this keeps happening until someone finally refuses to be ignored. If this story challenged you, pass it forward. Someone needs to see it. Subscribe to Black Community Struggles and stay with us as we confront injustice, truth, and the power of being seen.